And now what we're seeing instead is that there's a new function, the sustainable procurement function, which is sort of a merger of a lot of those things you're talking about. And these are folks that really, really care about the sustainability angle, the nature, the climate angle, but they're also highly specialized in contracting, into reviewing suppliers and onboarding suppliers. Like, I don't think a head of sustainability is someone that naturally was trained to onboard vendors and take them through like security questionnaires and things like that and negotiate those kind of agreements. It needed to be professionalized into more procurement. Now, what happened is these folks were not given a playbook to do that. The playbook that worked in many of the other procurement areas didn't work for carbon. I always joke like with my team and say like, we can't sell carbon like it's toilet paper, right? These are two very different things. And in many cases, they're like all of the older and more standard playbooks just were being trying to apply to carbon markets just didn't work. So
Yeah.
that's how we designed our platform with that in mind. So we designed it for the sustainability procurement folks who suddenly were thrown into the carbon markets, had to add carbon to sort of the long list of assets and certificates and things they were procuring. How do we make it really simple for them to do it, to tick all the boxes from that exercise while guaranteeing impact, cost efficiency, and risk management?
So welcome back to This Week in Carbon. My name is Rene Velasquez, your host for today. Eddie Smith is away this week, deservedly on a break. My guest today is Valerio Magliulo from Abatable, CEO of Abatable, who's a good friend. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to catch up with you, Valerio. It's been a little while since we last spoke. And I'm really excited for our audience to get to know you, your team, and the excellent work that you guys are doing. Can we start with just a little bit of context setting? Can you give us some background about yourself, how you arrived in the market, and then do a deeper dive in terms of what you're up to at Abatable?
Yes, let's do that. And thank you for having me. So excited for this chat. It's been a long time in the making. And so really, really glad we got to speak today. So by way of background, as you mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Abatable. We founded Abatable 5 years ago now, really at what was the height of the voluntary carbon markets under many different dimensions. My background is actually mostly in tech for social good. And that's kind of sort of how I described it. So I spent over a decade across tech organizations looking at how technology could solve real world and societal problems, ranging from using machine learning and deep learning for healthcare research, deploying AI at scale to fight misinformation across Meta and the family of apps during the pandemic, specifically working on financial inclusion in the UK, etc. So always been really, really fascinated about not just technology for the sake of technology, but how could technology be an enabler of real societal change. And so when I was sort of pondering what my next move was going to be, and when I was going to launch my own venture, I went naturally to see one of my best friends, Maria, and to tell her what I was up to. And she said, pause everything you're doing. Have you heard of carbon markets? And so she gave me sort of a quick elevator pitch. And literally what was supposed to be just a coffee catch-up turned into a quick message afterwards saying, are we onto something? Should we take the plunge? 30 days later, we had investment, we founded the business and haven't really stopped ever since. So that's kind of the genesis, really. Maria was working in impact investing and specifically within carbon markets, nature-based investments. So manage a lot of different corporate vehicle that were being deployed into nature-based solutions, both from an investment perspective, but also with the carbon and climate angle. And so we kind of married our two very different worlds and expertises to see if we could build a set of solutions to help a market that was sort of nascent or rather scaling up at the time that we launched Abatable, to be really efficient, structured, transparent, and standardized. And so that's what we've been trying to do ever since.
That sounds great. And it's always fun hearing the journey of other entrepreneurs because there's never a straight line drive and there's always got to be that spark. And I think there's nothing better than focusing on problems and trying to identify the solutions and how you can overcome them, and ultimately also finding the people that you gel with, where there's an alignment in terms of that
Yeah.
partnership, and then having that idea. How has that idea morphed? Because essentially you identified a niche early on, and I'm just curious to see how that thesis has been borne out, and ultimately now where you sit, because it's now more than just you and Maria, right? Your team has grown actually quite
Yeah.
significantly, and you've got some really amazing people on your side and on your team. Give us some context around that journey of the business and how that business case has actually transformed over time.
I think when we came into the carbon markets, and by the way, just to frame it a little bit, you're spot on. Is like sort of that spark moment for me was I'm very pragmatic person. I have sort of ideals and a vision for the future, but I'm also like constantly looking for what's the next best thing we can do right now and then in next year, etc. And I do feel like that's what really attracted me to the carbon markets in the early days of me exploring these solutions, because it is really the most powerful tool that we have in the near to medium term to slow climate change down and allow us to do societal transformation at scale. And so when we looked at it and we looked at what sort of angle we wanted to play into the carbon markets, our intuition was that the market was heavily reliant on bilateral transactions and over-the-counter transactions. At the time, there were some trading platforms. I think you used to work for one of them when we started Abatable. That's how we got to know each other.
Yep.
But it didn't quite feel like that's what corporate buyers were naturally gravitating towards, because it just didn't fit the mental model and the frameworks that sustainability professionals, CSOs, etc., were used to working with. And so when we came into the market, I think a lot of the motivations for investing in carbon projects and buying carbon credits, retiring carbon credits, was for more philanthropic reasons than a strategic business rationale that was developed, was well thought out and skilled and enthusiasts across the entire organization, right? And so naturally, that was much more the realm of bilateral and over-the-counter transactions. But as we saw the path for the market to scale, we saw a lot of gaps. Like number one was the standardization of even information sharing between supply and demand side, right? Like what project developers and suppliers felt they needed to share with buyers and what buyers were expecting. It was just in two different languages. Transparency on how prices and price discovery worked was just not really there, right? You were communicated a price, and the price, you were a price taker in that sense, right? If you were a buyer in many situations. So when we started out, I think we wanted to find the easiest way for us to fix those problems. And this was well before ICVCM and sort of all the improvements in methodologies, etc. And so the first bet that we wanted to make is, can we as an organization identify what high quality projects look like within this market and put them in front of buyers? And so in a way that buyers believe the work that's gone through and the work these projects have gone through to pass our bar, so to speak, right? We didn't want to...
So like a due diligence layer.
Yeah, it was like sort of embedded into the transaction, right? It's almost like, yes, there's a transaction, but there's also like some additional layer of confidence and comfort that we can provide you around what you're buying. And so that was kind of, I guess, more of aggregating supply, finding which supply we felt most closely matched what our clients wanted, and then trying to facilitate transactions. And that worked. It started to sort of gain some traction. But what we came to quickly realize is that there wasn't any amount of supply that we could aggregate that would fit and match all of the diverse and complex requirements that the various clients we were speaking to had posed in front of us, right? And I'm talking right now, we have a global remit of clients from Japan to Brazil, US to Australia, through tech companies, financial services, heavy polluting industries, right? And their profiles all look very, very different, what they're looking for in the carbon markets. And so we came across this like massive gap, right? So we don't want to build a balance sheet as an organization. We want it to be leaner. We want it to be more tech-driven and data-driven. So the next best thing we could do was switching the model around. So instead of being more supply-led and aggregators of supply, so instead of aggregating supply, we focus on aggregating demand. And that's been, I guess, the major evolution that Abatable has gone through over the last few years. And sort of thinking in terms of, we're not working on behalf of the suppliers to identify buyers who'd be interested in that specific project, but we're working on behalf of the buyers to find which projects. And so casting as wide a net as possible into the market. And that's where our procurement platform was built out of that insight. And that's what been for the past 3 years what we've been focusing on most heavily.
And that's a really interesting pivot, because you mentioned at the time when you entered, you referenced essentially buyers were price takers at the time. The market was in ascension. We had an increase in liquidity,
Yeah.
growth in terms of participation, standardization across certain subsets of the market around spot contracts, and then ultimately futures across CME and then ICE. And then that begat this kind of arms race as more and more buy sides started to emerge and trading houses started to take positions. The low-hanging fruit were taking out, and essentially buyers then had to be price takers. But there's been an inversion over the past few years where now the
Totally.
buyers are the ones setting the terms, and it is truly a buyer's market. So it's really interesting that then your business model essentially inverted to reflect that changing in terms of behavior in the market. So that makes total rational sense. How does your procurement platform work from the buyer's perspective? So you mentioned a wide array of different corporate and institutional buyers coming through across different industries, different geographies. Walk us through the journey of their journey in terms of looking and identifying for those areas of supply that may not have the deepest liquidity, and how you go about in actually aggregating and identifying that supply.
And if I can just add first, I think just to double down on your point, that transition that we've made and that transition the market has seen, I pointed to a professionalization of the sustainable procurement function. About 5 years ago and a little bit longer than that, this was sort of really the head of sustainability or the CSO that was sort of running these carbon programs and these climate contribution programs and carbon neutrality really in many cases.
Yeah, and oftentimes it sat alongside the other mandates that they had as part of their
Correct.
jobs, the reporting and all the other things, and they were so stretched so thinly, and it
All the
sat
time.
on their desk, and oftentimes it would bounce around with procurement, treasury teams, and legal and risk teams sometimes, and other times it would just be sitting on that CSO's desk, and they would be reliant on intermediaries to provide them with that high touch solution. So
That's
it was not
exactly right.
professionalized, to your point. It was very much bespoke every single time.
And now what we're seeing instead is that there's a new function, the sustainable procurement function, which is sort of a merger of a lot of those things you're talking about. And these are folks that really, really care about the sustainability angle, the nature, the climate angle, but they're also highly specialized in contracting, into reviewing suppliers and onboarding suppliers. Like, I don't think a head of sustainability is someone that naturally was trained to onboard vendors and take them through like security questionnaires and things like that and negotiate
Conduct
those
deep
kind of
KYC and
agreements.
AML.
It needed to be professionalized into more procurement. Now, what happened is these folks were not given a playbook to do that. The playbook that worked in many of the other procurement areas didn't work for carbon. I always joke like with my team and say like, we can't sell carbon like it's toilet paper, right? These are two very different things. And in many cases, they're like all of the older and more standard playbooks just were being trying to apply to carbon markets just didn't work. So that's how we designed our platform with that in mind. So we designed it for the sustainability procurement folks who suddenly were thrown into the carbon markets, had to add carbon to sort of the long list of assets and certificates and things they were procuring. How do we make it really simple for them to do it, to tick all the boxes from that exercise while guaranteeing impact, cost efficiency, and risk management? So that's kind of what our platform really does. So it starts from what the strategy of our clients is and what the corporate buyers are, like what their procurements are, what their goals, targets, profile of emissions, and sort of tries to delineate what kind of projects might be in scope and under what conditions and requirements. Those requirements and criteria then filter out the database that we keep of all projects across the BCM. And we now track over 13 registries, so pretty much most of the active liquid supply in the market. And so are able to say, right, there is 300 projects that fit your criteria. And in most cases, we'll know.
Can I ask you, does your coverage look at not just the spot tons, but also go upstream in terms of the pending supply or supply in terms of early stage opportunities?
We take a very expansive view of what supply looks like. And so that means that we're not only looking at what credits are available in the market today, sort of let's call it unretired supply, but we also look at projects that are being developed and are being registered. And in many cases, through our engagement with many suppliers, we now have over 1,100 suppliers registered on the Abatable platform. So they have an active account with the Abatable platform. They tell us proactively, hey, we're working on projects X, Y, and Z. So if you ever come across a buyer that's looking at those, please flag that, even though it's not appearing on the registry just yet, right? So that's kind of like the way we can bring a lot more, I guess, an easier way to filter through all of the data that there is in the market. And we'll use that kind of
That's a
filtering
really
and criteria.
interesting
Yeah.
point. Can I just double click on that
Yeah.
one, Valerio? Because you mentioned, obviously, I spent 10 years at Expansive and operating, the CBL markets exchange, but it's still a very liquid and active exchange, but it's a matching engine that only
Mhm.
settles on spot tons. So it mitigates counterparty and delivery risk by having escrow functionality and direct connectivity to the registries. But it hadn't unlocked up until that time that I was there, the forward conundrum. There was always that part of the iceberg as unseen because it hadn't yet issued and could not enter the marketplace. So in this case, actually does look at spot and the forward volumes that oftentimes in the primary market are really where the action is. And that matching engine is really interesting because that's where the buy side demand is for. Essentially, there are pockets in this market, and I'd love you to elaborate on this, but nature-based
Mhm.
removals in particular are highly sought after under VM47, so ARR methodologies, blue carbon. These types of projects are really in high demand. So how does then that matching occur? Now a project in your database of those 11,000 projects across the 13 registries is flagged essentially from the demand side. One of your buyers, it hits. This is a potential match. What are the processes then to ultimately beget a transaction, and how do you operate within that space?
What our clients really like to see is a process that mirrors how they normally think about procurement. And in many cases, most enterprise grade corporates would run an RFP, an RFQ, and we call them RFX because it depends on the complexity and the stages maybe involved. But it boils down to an RFP, right? So once you've identified effectively your set of suppliers and target outreach, what you invite all of the suppliers to do is to submit a bespoke proposal for that buyer. This is the bit that I think is sort of taking an abstraction that exists, unfortunately, in corporate procurement, which is the RFP and the complex procurement, and making it as standardized, as repeatable, and as scalable as possible. What I mean by that is a supplier that is engaged with a Abatable platform and responded to one RFP then can use that exact same response for 100 other RFPs, right? And just making the tweaks as relevant. They can change the pricing offers, the commercial proposals, and all of that, but the core of the data that they share with that buyer will be 90% of the cases the same across other buyers. So suddenly,
So now can
we
scale.
structured that can scale. You don't have all of a sudden. We spoke to many developers when we were starting to build out the platform in the early days, and we asked what's your biggest pain point? We were trying to sell to corporate buyers, and they said we see tens of RFPs every single month that have very complex supplier onboarding process attached to it to even access the RFP, and then those RFPs all asked information in a very different way. So we have people that work full time to respond to RFPs, and we cannot respond to all of them. So suddenly what we can do is we can do those 10 RFPs very easily, right? Because we're giving the confidence to the corporate buyers that the way we structure and standardize the RFP on their behalf with the appropriate level of customization to take into account sort of customer specific circumstances is now all of a sudden democratized across the market.
Yeah,
And
that's really powerful.
and
Are
that's
you
powerful
also
on the
then
spots, but also on the forward. That's what you're saying. Last year, we saw 60% increase in forward and offtakes
Yeah.
compared to 2024, right? So then suddenly, when it comes to spot, it may be less evident, but on the forward basis, there's less data, there's less information available. There may not be as many credit rating agencies that have looked at those projects just yet, and will be starting to do that. And so suddenly there's an even greater asymmetry of information that we need to fix and solve for.
That's really interesting. You said two things. Can I just go back to them? And so this is a question, but I suspect it's from what you mentioned that you're doing that because effectively you're creating that standardization from the project developer perspective. Are you also acting as a central KYC and AML layer effectively by onboarding those vendors? You're conducting KYC one time, and now your clients, the buy side clients, can effectively leverage your processes so that they don't have to replicate that every single time.
That's correct. But in most cases, actually, this is where there's still many steps into the process. And maybe I'll just walk you through them quickly. But
Yeah, please.
once you've got all of the responses through from the suppliers, what you end up doing is having to filter through and finding the gems, finding the things that are matching your criteria, matching your constraints in budget, etc., delivery timeframes. So we have a lot of different tools that we help our buyers use to do that. But one of the things that we do is also our layer of due diligence and screening the tools that we have embedded into the platform. These range from geospatial screening tools through AI-based tools that effectively screen projects on a very superficial level to produce an initial assessment, and all the way to our analyst-based assessment of projects. All of these are additional data points and intelligence that we're able to provide and sort of layer on to the RFP response so that the buyer not only has the information from the suppliers, they have additional layer of assurance from us they can use to improve their decision-making process. And I think that's really powerful because previously that was just a weight that was expected from the corporate buyer to just sort of do and have on their shoulders, when in reality it's not core skill set. Assessing a carbon quantification model shouldn't be something that a head of sustainability needs to know inside out for 25 project types, right? That's unrealistic expectation if we want the market to scale. So I think that sort of things then lead to a portfolio that meets the balance of cost, impact, and risk that our clients are looking for. And so when we're looking at them to structuring the transactions, in many cases, we end up acting as the contracting counterparty, which reduces and minimizes that KYC risk. Now, we are remunerated on the demand side, which is one way we eliminate any kind of conflict of interest and are able to work very effectively with so many suppliers as we do. But most importantly, many of the suppliers and project developers we work with, in many cases, will not be able to pass supplier onboarding processes that big tech companies, like big consulting firms have, as far as like vendor questionnaires, etc.
And also the credit risk oftentimes because their balance sheets just they couldn't pass and face them directly. So that 100%. Central nexus is really key. That's actually really interesting. And also just coming back to something that you said, Valerio, sorry to jump in here, but it's really interesting how you framed and again, it's coming back to what you said earlier around you had a thesis, you started the business, and then as you've engaged on this journey, you've listened to what your clients are asking for. And where is the gap? Not only is the procurement process broken and now you're creating a standardized platform for that, but you're overlaying it with an intelligence layer over the top of that so they can make more informed decisions and obviously ultimately arrive at a decision as opposed to paralysis.
And I think this is why we don't call ourselves a trading platform or an exchange of sorts, right? Even though you could almost say that we are, right? And we intentionally call it a carbon procurement solution platform because of all the intelligence that we layer on top of it. It's a recognition of the maturity that many of the clients have with regards to such a novel market. And so the need for having more of a partner that can walk them through that journey rather than sort of being left to make all of those decisions by themselves, right? And we see time and time again, that is the biggest bottleneck when those teams are not able to explain internally to their stakeholders, to their leadership, why certain decisions were made around the specific portfolio and the price. How do you know that was the best price you've paid, right? We can provide all of that data and the transparency around it so that they can confidently answer those questions and get much stronger buy-in within the organization and scale those programs as a result.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'd agree with your assessment that you're not an exchange. And I'll postulate two reasons as to why you're not. Even though there's a procurement platform and you're streamlining the execution of the transactions, I think if I'm wrong here, but are you publishing the prices that your clients on the buy side are actually executing at? Are you publishing that price data?
And
no. That's deliberate, right? So that's deliberate because you're ultimately acting as their RF provider, essentially a host. And so there's no price discovery. That's one element of an exchange. That's critical. And also exchanges act and operate on an anonymous basis, right? To spur greater liquidity. And it's not just a one-way street of procuring, but ultimately there's buying and selling and there's trading of those credits. You're not actively trading and you're not actively disclosing the pricing. And then you're also not acting purely on an anonymous basis. I would imagine that when a seller is responding to an RFP, there's some sort of transparency of who the buy side is in this case.
Yeah.
So there are 2 to 3 ingredients that necessitate that you're not an exchange, but it walks like a duck, but it's not a duck. It's kind of a swan.
And I think, you made a very good point. It was a deliberate design choice, right? The reason why we don't provide that level of transparency on the price that was settled, let's call it that, is because that does not match with the legal requirements that most of our corporate buyers would have.
Completely agree.
They would have, very, very strict rules
confidentiality
around
covenants on their contracting. Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then on the supplier side, what we try to, that's really important information though. So if you participate in a tender, you don't know what price the winning portfolio was cleared at. But what we end up doing is actually for every single RFP or RFX that we run, we provide a PDF report of a pricing insights and volume insights back to all the participants. So at least they can get a sense of like, right, across afforestation projects, this is the spread of prices we've seen. This is sort of some of the quality markers that we've seen. And that we found project developers really like that because it gives them an understanding of how to be more competitive in the next RFP for certain types of customers. And I think that's something that we want to do more and more of, and we want to do it even better, more dynamic than we do today.
Great. And I think that that's a really great service to the market. Another thing, just in terms of observation, obviously our teams have collaborated quite a lot in the last year or so. And it's really great to actually be a participant on your platform, right? Because there's such great two-way information. Not only are you ingesting that data set around pricing and availability and all of that sort of side of it, which is good and smooth transactions, but it's also a two-way street. You play a very active role in educating the market and providing and distributing a lot of that knowledge and intelligence. Can I use that as a pivot to talk about this institutional excellence that you have developed specifically around Corsia? And obviously, you've got some really unique personnel that give you that kind of that edge. Can you talk about your team and certainly around the aviation focus, and then also how you're seeing that market evolve? I think it'd be a really interesting conversation for our audience.
I think in a market that has put trust as the central pillar of everything it does, and sort of the defining marker of quality of the relationship, quality of the transaction, and quality of the scalability of the market, we very, very quickly picked up that our reputation needed to be one of thought leaders, one of trusted advisors, of collaborators, and it wasn't just about how much volumes do we transact. I mean, we say like we've transacted over 55 million tons, right? Like I think that's sizable like track record that we can claim in this market and how small the market is. But equally, we spent a long time thinking about what is it that people want to hear in the market? What is it people want to understand better? And how do we position ourselves not as just an additional voice who's going to write a recap on COP26, but rather like how do we actually tell people something they haven't heard yet, or get explained something that they might not be really getting an explainer for. That came a lot before building the platform and scaling the approach to how we support our clients. And so naturally, we've been able to capitalize on that position as thought leaders. And it's really core to our identity. That's the conscious decisions that we made around hiring the people that we've hired to continue like pushing that agenda and positioning Abatable as a thought leader in the market, but also one that is a collaborator in the market. So we're constantly out there speaking to any organization, contributing as much as we can to consultations, working with governments, because we truly think that it really takes a village, right? And we want to be able to do that effectively to help build the market, right? That's kind of how we think about it. So conscious decisions in hiring and Corsia, now that we are sort of kickstarting our efforts into Corsia, and we started about like towards end of last year with our first pilot transaction in Corsia, we approached it the exact same way, right? Like our success, if I can put our success down to something, it's really the trust and the reputation we've built in the market. And so how can we do that also in Corsia? What do people want to know about Corsia that they don't already get it from like official sources, etc.? And so that's where we've been leading the way.
Yeah, that's great. No, I really like that. It's a responsible actor playing a key role in helping to shape a market. There's elements of being a market maker, but also a custodian in your answer. And I believe that that's truly the best way to operate in a market, because as you mentioned, carbon's not yet fully commoditized, right? And there's certainly a long way to go around the standardization. There's so much, like you said, difference around the different project types. I had a conversation with Ingo Poole for a different podcast, and that episode will come out in the next couple of months. So, he's at another shop of, but one of the carbon market veterans, and he had a really interesting analogy around commodities broadly, but he was talking about ag in particular, and how there are different commodities in agriculture. How you've got coffee and you've got potatoes and you've got orange juice and you've got a whole bunch of different different attributes. And essentially, I'll kind of paraphrase it here, but essentially carbon is like that agricultural commodity, essentially, right? What you're measuring it is calories. In this case, the lingua franca is the ton of CO2 equivalent, but it comes from various different sources and different industries specifically. You've got direct air capture being very different from nature-based removals, right? Who are very different from cook stove projects. And so the risk lens for each one of those various different commodities within this, or sub-commodities within this broader commodity ecosystem of carbon takes a different lens to ultimately transact. And therefore, transactions actually are done at the speed of trust, and all business is operating at the speed of trust. And so by building that rapport, by building that knowledge base and that level of authority and working collaboratively, I think that begets the transactions, because companies do business with other companies because of the people that do business with those people. So can we just again kind of come back now to Corsia, because it's really interesting. I had a conversation with Juan Carlos, your Director of Knowledge and Policy at the World Sustainability Symposium, WSS, in Hong Kong last October, I believe it was. And so Juan Carlos Arredondo Brun is also on the technical advisory body of Corsia. Yep. So incredibly knowledgeable person, having been in and around this space for some time. I think prior to joining you guys, he was at McKinsey. So good get there. But obviously,
an Article 6 negotiator for...
An Article 6 negotiator. For Mexico, exactly. So he's been in the rooms and helping to structure the systems, but he also understands very well the intricacies of the market, the shortfalls of a regulator, in this case ICAO, and what it can and can't do, because it's membership led and it can stipulate certain rule sets and guidelines around what's eligible and not eligible, but then it's binary, and then ultimately ICAO is putting the onus on the programs that they administer, and then those programs, the Veras, the gold standards of the world, then put the onus on the projects to ultimately deliver. And then there's this kind of cascade effect. But the market has been fragmented, and so in Corsia, I want to sort of now do a deep dive. How are you seeing the market itself? And for our audience, I just want to contextualize. We're in phase 1 of Corsia, the 2024, 25, and 26. In this phase implementation approach is the phase 1. The airlines have a compliance obligation globally, as their member states have opted in to Corsia. They have a deadline of January 31st of 2028 in order to meet that compliance for the first phase. And then we've got the compliance phase, which is obligatory for all member states to that are party to ICAO, which is a UN sister agency, I should say, starting from 2027 all the way through 2035. And it's a critical pillar for the industry to decarbonize, creating a level playing field. And it's one of the 4 sort of core pillars. Corsia essentially allows for airlines to purchase carbon credits as well as decarbonize through sustainable aviation fuel. There's operational efficiency and technological efficiency, but it is the carbon offset reduction scheme for international aviation. And with that sort of intro, the market today in phase 1 is heavily constrained. There's a real fear in the market that there's a short squeeze that is looming because of bottlenecks that exist in that market. Yes, there are eligible emission units guidelines, programs that are eligible, methodologies ultimately that are recognized, those that are excluded as well. But projects are having a hard time to getting the accreditation and the EEU, the eligible emission unit tag in the registries, because they're ultimately dependent on a third party, this time the host governments that play a key role. It's not just a pure binary seller-buyer market. There's a third player here because essentially it's a sister agency of UNFCCC, and ultimately relies on the Paris Agreement architecture of corresponding adjustments. So that's a long-winded sort of context setting, but obviously I'm cognizant that a lot of our audience may not be carbon experts, so I don't want to assume that. So now that, there's trickling supply coming into this market, I believe we're at 10, if I'm not mistaken, 10 projects to date that have gained the accreditation. How are you seeing it in terms of the advice and the engagement that you have with clients, presumably the airlines that are looking to meet their compliance? And how are you helping them to start to procure on that forward curve to ameliorate the risk of a shortfall?
Okay, where to start? I think the natural starting point is we've been doing a lot of work to forecast in as accurate possible way what the demand is going to look like for Corsia units for both phase 1 and phase 2. At Abatable,
can you give us some high-level numbers around your analysis?
Yeah, we published them as well. Yeah, it's also published on our website, but we expect roughly between 200 and 220 million tons of demand. Wow. And we expect at least 800, if not up to 1,600 million tons of demand for phase two. So
Wow.
that I think is a really, really important thing to play in mind, right? As you mentioned, phase one being sort of the semi-compliance phase, let's call it semi-compliance, right? In terms of what exactly is expected. Most countries don't yet have rules and penalties for non-compliance for phase one. And so really looking at phase two as the make it or break it for this market. So when we're looking at 200 to 220 for phase one, we currently have, as you mentioned, only 10 projects that have been there, sort of have eligible units. That's for about 31 million tons of supply. So there's already a massive shortfall for phase one. But when we're looking at phase two, that shortfall becomes even more staggering. The amount of administrative capacity that needs to be scaled across so many host countries across the world, and particularly sort of the global south as sort of the main producers of carbon credits, is terrifying. So I think that's what we're really, really looking at is, right, phase one is important. We need this market to succeed. So phase one needs to be a success, but also we need to start building the capacity today for phase one. This is not dissimilar to how the tech CDR and the tech carbon removal space is starting to invest a lot into capacity for supply because they're gearing up for when net zero targets are coming up and when we'll need to do a lot of carbon removal at scale to comply with net zero targets. Exactly the same, with the exception that second phase is a lot sooner than many of the net zero targets that voluntary corporate buyers have. And so the supply is there in terms of potentially eligible supply. But really the biggest bottleneck will be, as you mentioned, the letter authorizations from host countries, the ability to rely on host countries' processes for applying a corresponding adjustment and marking these credits and these units for international transfer. Now, that's the role that insurance providers in theory are there to kind of fill that gap and sort of providing solutions that de-risk where there is not yet a corresponding adjustment, there's only an authorization letter, or where there's not yet a process even in place and administratively with the host country to do so. That insurance capacity still needs to scale. So that's an additional blocker, right? So when you combine those two things, that's a perfect recipe for a lot of uncertainty around phase two and the ability to comply with requirements.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really eloquent way that you framed it. And if I can just sort of summarize that, essentially there are two bottlenecks or rate limiting steps, to borrow from my old science kind of nomenclature, in order to ultimately yield the required supply. I think to your point, there is also this chicken. So just in summarize, it's the insurance and the actual corresponding adjustment pathways. And oftentimes, like you said, governments are still trying to create the jurisprudence, the legal frameworks, the architecture that's required in order to ultimately export these tons from their ledger under the Paris Agreement accounting frameworks. But there's also this chicken and egg component, which I really want to kind of come back to, and because I don't want to gloss over it. What you said is really true. Phase one, whilst it's not a compliance phase in the ICAO nomenclature, once a government has voluntarily opted in, then there is a presumption that those member states will pass on that compliance obligation to their carriers within their regulatory purview. And that's certainly the case of the jurisprudence of the legal underpinning for it. But there are lack today of enforcement mechanisms and penalties for non-compliance. And a lot of the airlines that we speak with, and we've been really privileged also being trusted as a partner and strategic partner in this space, working with folks like IATA, also with some OEMs, which we'll announce in the next few weeks, to try to help to unlock a lot of these bottlenecks and try to create this capacity and this kind of knowledge transfer. But it's this realization with the lack of enforcement that a lot of airlines are stuck in a holding pattern because they are, to the procurement piece, having to go to Treasury to essentially have the requisite budgets in order to go out there and procure. Then the Treasury teams are asking, what am I buying? And is it compliance ready?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, for the 34 million tons that you mentioned that are available today. But 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, that was a lot less. It was closer to 20 million tons. And then if we're going to contract on a forward basis because an airline has a significant requirement for compliance, there are questions of, will I get, what are the conditions precedents to definitely get a Corsia eligible unit? And so there's this gray area. And then Treasury then says, okay, well, if we don't comply, what is the penalty? And the answer is, well, today we don't have one, but we're liaising with our regulator and we're waiting to see what they come down with down the pipe. It ultimately leads to inaction. And this lack of formation of demand, of clearly defined demand signal, I think is also hampering the supply side. Not at the project developer level, because I think that there's a recognition at the project developer level that there's an opportunity here to deliver into this massive demand pool that's latent, however. And I think where there's this decouple is, like you said, at the host country level, that many host governments haven't yet realized that they have an active role, not only as regulators and enforcers of this system that they've signed up to, but also to help unlock that supply quotient, and that there's an inherent opportunity here from an economic perspective. How are you and your team also engaging with governments and helping to try to create that level of knowledge transfer and or sort of system architecture, or is that beyond your remit?
I would like to say that it's beyond our remit, but in reality, we like to keep ourselves as busy as possible, and we end up doing probably too many things that we can actually chew.
Yeah, but no, but
We're still a small team.
Yeah, man. Look, you're not alone. I think we're in that boat, and maybe it's a loaded question. I'll give you some context. For us, ultimately, Valerio is a trading firm. Like yourselves, we're quite active in this market, trading across primary and secondary markets. That's the lifeblood of the business. But the advisory component of our business is taking on these mandates that are not traditional, that are problem solvers as trusted partners to engage at the problem, and it's kind of akin to a mechanic looking under the hood and going, "Whoa, we need to replace this engine," and sometimes you need to change them again, like everything in the thing, right? And sometimes you just have to just hold the hand and kind of sometimes act as a therapist. But that remit is really broad, and it may not be linearly correlated. But if it ultimately leads out, at least my prism, the way I look at it, is if it ultimately leads to a beneficial outcome that grows the market overall, then there's a benefit. It may not translate immediately with regards to transaction, which is the classic trader model. I'm only going to invest time if I'm going to actually get a transaction here. But if it actually begets that rising tide, then that's the right way to look at it, because now again you have an asymmetry in this case, or we have one, around being part of that architecture to help to build that knowledge transfer. So that's kind of my context. So your reflection on that, like you said, sometimes you take off or you bite more than you can chew. Are you at liberty to discuss some of those sort of problems? Because it's kind of interesting to be sometimes in those weeds.
I 100%. I mean, a lot of people ask me, what's the biggest thing you've learned being a founder? I'm a first-time founder, right? It's my first time starting a business. And I always say it is, knew I had to build a company. I just never expected I also had to help build a market around the company, right? And that's like I think that's a very good reflection on what the voluntary carbon market and everything surrounding it looks like. Like we all have an important role to play. Like, I mean, you and I are also involved in AITA and like a lot of different organizations. We try to, as much as possible, to provide our expertise, our point of view and our perspectives to help shape those frameworks, that guidelines, and support as many actors as possible. So we do a lot of work, predominantly, you call it pro bono, with governments, particularly of host countries, and where there's a lot of latent carbon supply that could be eligible for Article 6 frameworks or Corsia. And so that's certainly an area that we've been exploring a lot more actively. So how do we just define that as one of the biggest bottlenecks for Corsia to really take off? Sorry for the pun.
But no, don't worry, you're not alone. I keep saying holding pattern and I just keep thinking, oh my God, cringe. My clients are going to keep just cringing at me. But it's true. It is about to take off. There is that expectation that the market will be. But I think that there's a real inclusion. Can I also reflect on that the airline industry is so inclusive and wanting to have this conversation with the suppliers, the regulators, the standards, because ultimately the aviation industry is a really difficult to abate sector. Just the physics dictate a dependence on hydrocarbons because of the fuel density to energy ratio, and then the thrust that's required to get the planes off the ground. And I don't want to be hypocritical, but we in the first world are dependent, and certainly in business, dependent on connectivity. And that's what airline industry is. It's a business of connection, literally and figuratively. Like if you're making a connection between flights, not to sound too trivial, but it is that. And you think about it, for me, like it was really prescient during the pandemic. I had a little baby and my parents couldn't come to see their little grandchild. And as we were grounded, they didn't get to meet her for the first 2 years of her life. And so there's a material impact that we felt during COVID. And I think that absence of that global ability to travel and to have that, whether it was vacations or seeing family or business connections, was really felt. And so to me, the airline industry is such a critical artery of global society, but they recognize also that their social license to operate is dictated very much in part with regards to how they address their emissions profile. And as the industry grows within a capitalistic model, as more and more demand for their services increases, they're finding it more and more difficult to wean that efficiency gains even further and further and further. And they've got two essentially levers that they can pull, and it's the sustainable aviation fuels, and that's a nascent industry, and they're trying to create incentives, and they're trying to build out that market from literally from scratch, and then ultimately carbon markets as that release valve. And so they're very, very engaging with market participants such as yourselves and others in order to try to help them to meet that ultimately that demand. And so it's just really interesting to see that space grow. And I think we have an obligation, we have a responsibility to play a key actor and role here to make that market take off.
Totally. And then I just think that one thing that we don't discuss enough is sort of the macroeconomic uncertainty, though, which applies to all corporates, not just the airlines, but the airlines particularly, more acute terms, right? There's still a lot of uncertainty around like certain countries' role in Corsia and how they view Corsia. There's still a lot of uncertainty around any mandates for SAF and whether they're going to be realistic, any major incentives to do so. And, there's the reality on the ground, which is carbon credits from voluntary standards have been identified as one of the key levers for Corsia. There is plenty supply to make sure that airlines are compensated for their emissions in line with the Corsia scheme, in line with ICAO's guidelines. We just have to do whatever it takes to get all of those, as many projects as possible, to be eligible and to be ready for the Corsia market. But I think there's, you made a really, really good point around sort of airlines being really, really engaged. And I 100% agree. That's been one of the most wonderful discoveries of this as we started to lean into Corsia. But I would also put them into two buckets. We've seen a lot of airlines engaging in trying to understand how do I maximize the sort of compliance outcomes for ourselves, and in a way that is aligned with how we normally procure these sort of things, how we procure aviation, like fuel and other things. And then there's others who I would put them, most of those ones, in more of the global south bucket, who may be more exposed to, number one, the impacts of climate change on sort of where they operate, where the people that work for them are based, and see the impact of a lot of the projects that are being deployed across sort of the global south and beyond to mitigate those impacts, and are actually turning around and say, well, you know what? Yes, Corsia is a compliance requirement, but how do we do more than that? How do we take that as an opportunity to engage with our local communities, right? To sort of replant degraded lands across the regions that we operate. Like, how do we do more than just what the compliance requirements are? And that's not necessarily in terms of like, how do we spend more? How do we do all those things? But it's more like, how do we treat that as not just a compliance exercise, a treasury exercise, but also truly a sustainability engagement tool? And that's been one of the sort of most fascinating things, and the conversation I enjoyed the most really with airlines.
Yeah, that's a really cool one. I have to agree on that one. The framing for that, I've got two conversations. Obviously, I can't disclose who they are, but global airline and global carriers who have said, yes, we have this compliance obligation and an imperative effectively to meet that. And Treasury wants to do it at lowest possible cost. That's great. And so I asked them at the time, if there's a pool of available supply today and you recognize that there's a short squeeze long term, why aren't you acting early? If you've already got approved budgets, why don't you just take advantage of that supply and get ahead of your competitors? And their answer was twofold. One, even though it's compliance, we won't just purchase the lowest common denominator. There's still a qualitative aspect, like the intelligence wrapper that you put across your procurement platform. We need to ensure that the credits that we purchase are duly Corsia eligible and mitigate against reputational risk, because that reputation, our brand, is where our value is attributed, because it comes down to people trusting our brand. That's core. And I thought that was really interesting. And then ultimately I asked, are you willing to pay more for that? And they said, yes. And then the other thing that I said, okay, so what else is holding you back? And their answer was, well, we recognize that there's a concentration risk if we purchase for just one project, or just two projects or three projects. We need to buy a portfolio. And I said, okay, well then define what that perfect portfolio would look like. And their answer was, back to your point around, airlines serve communities through their network. They fly from points A to B to C to D, etc. They would like, if possible, given the optionality, to source from that are both Corsia
Yes.
compliance, that have the quality inputs, integrity inputs, but also from those communities that they service, because they want to be a linkage. And so if you're a Latin American carrier, there's a less of a demand, let's say, for African-based projects, or vice versa. Or if you're an ASEAN or APAC carrier, less demand for, let's say, projects from Eurasia or from LATAM. And so they wanted to have an affinity as close as possible to the routes that they service, the communities that they service. And that's really interesting behavior from a buyer, because it's essentially, it is rational, but it's also irrational, because you think in a compliance environment, lowest cost wins. And there are, I will say, carriers that I've spoken to that are incredibly, I won't say which country it's from, because I was about to say the country and I was going to say, but it'll give it away. But they're super price sensitive. And they said, we're treasury, and it was just like this robotic view, lowest cost to comply. That's what I must do. And that's also rational behavior. But it's kind of interesting in this formation of the market that the folks that are making the decisions are looking at it from a very responsible procurement perspective, that ultimately they want to do that. Yeah, please. I want you to elaborate.
It's been 100% our experience as well. But can I add a third dimension as to why I think a lot of airlines are not leaning heavily today? It's because price discovery doesn't work yet in Corsia.
Oh, completely agree. We're about to deliver a mandate where that is one of the key deliverables, can I just tell you?
Right. So if I can explain to listeners, the way I normally conceptualize price discovery in the carbon market is you have a cost of developing a carbon project, you have a cost of capital that you need to apply to that cost, and then you have whatever you think is a reasonable margin and reasonable sort of to do business, depending on what kind of organization you are, whether you're nonprofit or profit. And depending how many people are in the chain, right? Realistically, that usually is how the price is determined, plus or minus some adjustments when you start to see trends in the market and how others are pricing credits. That is not how it's working in Corsia, right? Because we're basically saying, as long as these are EUs, which means they're fully eligible for me as an airline, effectively they should fetch a very similar price. Now, the main problem with pricing that I see in carbon markets, and it's not a problem that I'm complaining about, it's just a challenge that we need to overcome, and it's very structural and very to be expected in the early days of the market. But most of the price discovery has been anchored to one project that was a first mover into Corsia that decided what sort of the cost of that compliance units should be. And everything has been sort of anchoring against that one. So even when you're looking at futures in sort of from eyes and prices, in reality, they are just an evolution of that one single project price. So this is not yet an efficient price discovery mechanism, and most projects are being priced against that. But we're starting to see that sort of like slowly changing, and as more supply comes online, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more interesting pricing dynamics at play. So what I'm really trying to say with like that long-winded explanation is that airlines, when they're thinking about it from a compliance mechanism and sort of complying at the most effective cost, let's not just say like the least cost, most effective cost for compliance, they don't know yet that the price that they would pay today is truly, over the course of phase one, for starters, the most effective cost that they could pay. We only have very, very limited transaction data and price discovery data to be able to say that with certainty. So I think that's holding back a lot of the sort of treasury involvement into those conversations, right? Where there's other markets where you have a long history of trading, you can see price trends, and you can start to make some, analysis on like, okay, where would it likely be over the next year and a half or so? We can't do that with Corsia just yet. And so that's holding back a lot of demand. And so what the price discovery is doing is actually trying to understand what level of risk are you happy to take today versus take at delivery or at the compliance deadline, right? Which is January 2028, but not yet like how the whole market can deliver Corsia units at scale and at what price can it be done.
I agree around 95% of what you said, but I'm only going to disagree with 5%, but just because I'm a nerd. So this is nothing against what you said. But no, you're right. The one bit that I disagree with is that this kind of very like structural model of there's an input price, and then there's a fair margin, there's a cost of capital, et cetera, and then therefore this is a fair price. In markets, the market price is reflective of what the market is willing to tolerate, and there's margins, there's businesses with huge margins and those with very compressed margins. And it's ultimately a factor of supply, demand, and competition. So that's the only thing I'd say there. But absolutely agree with what you say.
But we agree on that. I didn't say it's a fair price. I think it's just the way the market works. It's not fair at all.
And so to your point, there hasn't been efficient price discovery because we've had very limited, and quite frankly, the art trees credits from Guyana, which Mercuria has been, offering over the last sort of year or so, was the only game in town for a long time, and there wasn't a clearing price that was distributed widely. There were herds. And there were participants, airlines transacting on a platform, which is my former employer, Expansive, and the Aviation Carbon Exchange, which had those quarterly auctions. And that was great, but that was the only game in town. Now that there are other projects, there is a possibility to have a bid-offer spread. In that scenario, there was just an offer price, and an airline would choose binarily. Do I want to purchase or not? And most didn't, right? But now there'll be an offer at $19 for a different project and one at $25 for a different project, potentially, right? Whatever the prices are. And now there's a market price discovery. And over time, you're not pricing at a basis spread to that project. You're actually starting to take that as a basis spread to the index, where that market ends up settling. And that is good because that represents choice. Now, the other thing that the market has been doing because of a lack of price discovery, because of a lack of bid and offer spread, is this really interesting behavior. There's an expectation in commodity markets typically where there's a contango. And again, I'm a nerd. So for folks in the audience that aren't familiar with that, it's essentially the relationship between a commodity's current or spot price and its future price, with the contango essentially occurring when the future prices are higher than the spot prices. So it's cheaper today to purchase effectively. Then there's a cost of carry, or there's sort of the capital requirements in order to purchase that today. What is the interest rate, et cetera? And then there's a sort of futures price. And so there's a natural contango. And that allows for financial intermediaries to start to hedge and start to enter into this market and effectively create some liquidity. But in Corsia today, and you referenced the ICE futures contract, there's essentially a backwardation, which is the inverse, where essentially the futures price is lower than the current spot price, which in this market, because of the fundamentals that we described, given that there's an expected shortfall that is material, it's not an immaterial shortfall. Like our forecasts are pretty similar to what you mentioned. You said somewhere in the 200 million ton for demand, like for phase one. We're about 165 million tons to 185 is sort of our bandwidth, and that's our internal view. But there's plus or minus in any sort of analysis and forecast, and that under an optimistic LOA and corresponding adjustment scenario, there's still a material shortfall. We're forecasting sort of around 90 to 120 million tons of supply coming through in time, right? So it's assuming that the compliance window stays static. It doesn't get kicked down the can and extended to 2029, for example. And if this time window stays very rigid, then we expect a shortfall of whatever that delta looks like. And so there should be, in theory, a contango. That short squeeze leads to volatility in the spike of the price and the December 27 contract. But that's not yet visible, right, on ICE. And it's, again, a factor of the lack of liquidity in the physical market or the spot market, and a lack of bid action open interest on the futures. And so there's this really weird time right now because pure play kind of first principles analysis will dictate I should go long on the Dec 27 contract if you're a trader, right? And if you're an airline, you want to hedge that risk to a certain extent. You want to ameliorate that price increase in volatility, but no one's willing to jump right now. And I think it's going to be a really interesting next 6 to 12 months, really, where the game is on for new projects to start to hit the market, supply to start to come in, some level of price discovery, more and more sort of unlocking of the bottlenecks, or the bottlenecks remain and the constraint exists, and now a spike in price starts to happen and more penalties start to come in and airlines really start to ramp up. It's going to be really an interesting phase, but the price will be what the price will be effectively in the market. And I'm keen to watch it.
I think it's also looking at the shape of the supply that is going to come online for Corsia, right? I think that's where it's really interesting.
Shape is an interesting word.
I don't know, maybe that's not the right word to use.
No, I think about it as shape, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think about it as a funnel, right? Like you talked about like this huge potential supply. Like when we do the analysis, there's billions of tons of potential supply around newly registered projects, obviously assuming that they get through the validation and verification. And then you get projects that are already in the pipeline that just are accredited, right? And then you kind of whittle it down to projects that meet the high level criteria. Are they from eligible programs? Tick. What's that cohort look like? Then methodology restriction, right? The ICAO tab, don't get me started. I talked about this with with the team around the double negative, triple negatives language in ICAO speak, but effectively they're exclusions, methodologies that are not eligible. And then you kind of wind down and it's like, oh, cool. The last step is like projects that meet all the criteria and they're technically eligible or aligned. And then those projects that actually jump the next fence with having the LOA, having the corresponding adjustment and the insurance, and boom, now it's that trickle effect. So we think about it very much like shape, and it's a
And
funnel.
that's the
It's a
funnel.
triangle.
That's the funnel.
Yeah.
What I mean is when you're looking at that last jump, you obviously need to understand from a political perspective, what the host countries are more likely to allow under international transfer. So apply a corresponding adjustments to. Are they going to allow for afforestation projects? Are they going to allow for more technical carbon removal innovation? Or are they going to allow for sort of some of the lower hanging fruits, and which tend to be more inexpensive climate mitigation activities? And so far, the ones that I have effectively received a letter of authorization are mostly cookstove projects, water purifier projects, with the one exception of sort of the artery project, right? That's really the shape that we're seeing of the projects that are coming online. And structurally, those activities tend to be more inexpensive compared to the Arteries project and sort of what it takes to do that project, and also many other projects that we see in the market, like very complex nature restoration project, mangroves, etc. And so I do think
they're
that
for the most part excluded. I asked, it wasn't just Juan Carlos. I asked Ruben Manonkara who's at WWF. And formerly Singapore's rep on the tab. I think he's finishing up. And I said, hey man, and sorry for Ruben for airing this out. He'll be on the podcast in a couple of weeks, I believe. But I said, hey, can you tell us? And I think it was actually one of your events at Ecosperity maybe last year. And I pulled him aside and said, hey man, is VM47 in or out of the ICAO like eligibility criteria? Can you settle this like argument? I had one lawyer telling me it's in and another lawyer telling me it's out. And I was just like, if I'm confused, the whole market's going to be confused. And he's like, no, it's out. And I was like, so is this triple speak out? And he goes, it's out. And I was like, oh man. So they've excluded a big chunk of nature-based avoidance and a big chunk of nature-based removals. And I think that's really important to kind of highlight because again, now you're throttling the potential supply, which is kind of nuts.
That's exactly, we're throttling the potential supply, but that's already excluded when we're looking at sort of the methodology type of eligibility, right? But then even without those exclusions, there's still like many kinds of project activities that are in scope, and they range in terms of cost of development and cost of capital like greatly. But I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is like what are countries more likely to allow to find a corresponding adjustment. So far, it's been mostly cook stoves, water purifiers, projects that are more inexpensive in the market. The cost, even when accounting for the cost of issuing an LOA, which it's pretty high at the moment in many countries. And so what I'm trying to say is that that's probably also where a lot of that backwardation is coming from, right? Which is not just about the crunch of supply and demand not being factored in, but actually the supply that we're starting to see coming to market is going to inevitably be more inexpensive. And that's an opportunity for project developers and supplier to offer a more cost-effective solution to comply with Corsia. Now, if the price of Corsia, if there was a price for Corsia units that we all agreed upon, that's the reference and the benchmark in the market, and let's call it $20 per ton, and you can deliver that, and your cost for delivering that is $10 per ton, that's great for you. Right? Like nobody's arguing against that. And I think that's where we should be moving towards if we're wanting to make a more efficient and liquid market. But that's not where we are. That doesn't happen at the moment, right? So that inevitably is going to push the price, what people think of the price for Corsia units down over the next couple of months.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. And also on the other side of it, like the ceiling is not yet discoverable because the penalties aren't yet in place. And so there's potentially up to $100 a ton, right? And if your penalty is going to be $100 a ton, but you're seeing in the $20 handle or $30 handle, then a rational actor goes ahead and purchases it. But if the ceiling's at 30 and your discount rate is at 20 right now, well, then I'll just take a wait and see approach. And that's where it's currently at, right? This kind of holding pattern or inaction. So it's a really interesting conversation. Valerio, just conscious of your time, I think we've gone a little bit over. Do you have any last words? I always like to finish with, in terms of interviews and conversations that I have with folks around, what are you hopeful for in your world, in the market? Just kind of broadly, what are you hopeful for 2026 and beyond?
I think the commitment is unwavering. And I don't mean to be like too idealistic or too optimistic, but it's true. Like all the corporate clients that we speak to, none of them are backing down. If they're slowing down, there's just more to pause and reflect on what how the strategy should evolve in this new world where we're all trying to live in. But the support and the commitment is not changing. And so that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of optimism for the future of the market and for our collective battle against climate change, right? Corporates know need to play a role, and they're looking for what are the most effective ways to do that within how they know how to do things as an organization, right? Which is really, really important to consider. So that gives me a lot of hope. And we've done so much work over the last 3 years as a market, as sort of collective organizations to raise the bar on integrity for supply and raise the bar on integrity of demand claims and policy developments and international alignment, which is no small feat, right? Like we always want more, but it's hard. So that gives me a lot of hope that we now have the foundations that we need to really turbocharge the market and scale our impact on climate. We just have to keep grinding.
I like it. I really like it. And you're absolutely right. In terms of reflection, I've been having this conversation over the last few weeks with a number of business leaders in our space. And the integrity side reforms have really been really foundational for our industry, just to rebuild the foundation, literally and figuratively. And it's a foundation that we need to have that's strong and robust enough to build upon to grow and scale the market. And so it's kind of like, you mentioned kind of when you started in this space, it was like the task force on scaling voluntary markets that then pivoted to the integrity council on voluntary markets. Yeah. And I feel like the integrity side reforms are not nearing their end. I don't think that there'll ever be an end because it's more of a journey, but I think that the foundations are solidly built. Now they're just and now there's a focus on how do we scale the market again? How do we engage buy-side participants and give them the confidence to transact? And then that's where the claims and all that other side of things, the SBTI side of the market exists. I think that another area, and I really want to use this as a way to commend you and your team, but it's certainly a reflection that I've had and, an impetus for why I started this platform, This Week in Carbon, but also the Carbon Exposure podcast and broader platform, which is the other, I think the Achilles heel of our market is one of a lack of communication. Oftentimes it's subject matter experts speaking with one another in this kind of echo chamber. And there's this information asymmetry, right? You need effectively a PhD to be in our market. And so many worthwhile projects exist. There is not a lack of high integrity credits in our market, but there is a significant lack around the communication of those projects, and ultimately comes down to lack of that spotlight or the inability to communicate. And I have to say, we're trying obviously at Carbon Exposure, Valerio, and This Week Carbon to try to leverage our platforms to encourage that broader communication. To you and your team, you guys are doing an amazing job in terms of distributing that signal around communicating and educating market. And I just want to shout you guys out. So your comms team deserves a raise.
I think they already know that. They do an amazing job at that. Thank you, Dom.
Good stuff.
Appreciate it.
Hey, Valerio, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you and look forward to catching up with you somewhere around the world next and wishing you and your team continued success. And thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rene. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise.